A small fishing harbor on the edge of a quiet coastal town once had an odd story that older dock workers still mention when the conversation drifts late into the night. And the strange part was not that a boat disappeared for several days, because that happened occasionally when storms rolled through. The strange part was that when the boat came back drifting slowly into the harbor mouth, the engine was still humming softly. The lines were neatly tied the way the fishermen always tied them. And inside the small cabin, there was a plate of freshly cooked fish sitting on the little metal table, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment and planned to return any second. Before we start, please subscribe if you haven't already. The fisherman's name was Daniel Hargreaves, a quiet man in his early 40s who had spent most of his life working the waters outside the town. People around the harbor described him as steady and predictable, the kind of person who left at almost the exact same time every morning, brought back his catch before evening, and stopped at the same small diner near the docks before walking home. His boat, a narrow white vessel named **Marable, was not particularly large or modern, but Daniel maintained it carefully, and the engine ran so smoothly that some of the other fishermen joked it sounded quieter than the gulls flying overhead. Daniel lived alone in a small house overlooking the shoreline, and although he kept to himself, the townspeople trusted him completely. He did not drink much, he never caused trouble, and he rarely missed a day on the water unless the weather was truly dangerous. Over the years, he developed a routine that never seemed to change, and because of that routine, people noticed immediately when something unusual happened. On a cool morning in late autumn, Daniel left the harbor just after sunrise, pushing the **Marable** out past the last line of buoys, while the sky was still gray with early light. One of the dock workers watched him go, noticing that Daniel gave the usual small wave without saying anything, and then the boat slowly disappeared toward the deeper water where he normally set his lines. Nothing about that morning seemed strange. The weather stayed calm throughout the day, the wind was light, and several other fishermen passed through the same area where Daniel usually worked. None of them reported seeing his boat that afternoon, but that was not immediately alarming because the waters were wide, and everyone followed their own fishing routes. By the time evening arrived, Daniel still had not returned to the harbor. The dock workers assumed he had decided to stay out longer to improve his catch, which was something fishermen sometimes did when conditions were good, and no one thought much about it that night. The next morning, however, his boat was still missing. Another day passed, and then a third. By that point, people in the harbor began to worry because Daniel had never stayed out that long before, especially without telling anyone. The local Coast Guard conducted a search across the nearby waters, moving slowly through the areas where Daniel usually fished, but they found nothing unusual. No floating gear, no damaged boat, no signal from the **Marable's* small radio beacon. It was as if the boat had simply disappeared somewhere beyond the horizon. For several days, the town remained uneasy, and the dock workers quietly discussed what might have happened, suggesting possibilities like engine trouble, a sudden storm far out at sea, or even the chance that Daniel had become ill while alone on the boat. Then, 5 days after he first left the harbor, something very strange happened. Early in the morning, while the fog still hung low over the water, a young harbor worker noticed a boat drifting slowly toward the entrance channel. At first, he assumed it belonged to one of the fishermen returning from an overnight trip, but as the vessel moved closer, he recognized the shape and faded white paint. It was the **Marable*. The boat glided forward at a slow, steady pace, not crashing or drifting sideways like a damaged vessel would, but moving straight through the channel as if someone were carefully steering it. Except there was no one visible on the deck. The harbor worker called out to the others, and several men rushed down the dock as the boat continued moving forward. Its small engine still running with the same quiet hum Daniel had always kept it in. When the asterisk marble finally bumped gently against the dock, the engine remained running. The steering wheel turned slightly to the right like it had been held that way moments earlier. The men climbed aboard expecting to find Daniel somewhere inside, but the deck was empty. They checked the small sleeping compartment near the bow. Nothing. Then they stepped into the narrow cabin where Daniel normally cooked and kept his equipment. That was where things became unsettling. On the small metal table bolted to the floor, there was a plate with a freshly cooked fish, neatly cut, and seasoned the way Daniel often prepared his meals while out at sea. Next to it sat a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and the small gas stove nearby still felt slightly warm, as if it had been used recently. The strangest detail was that the fish had not spoiled. It looked like it had been cooked only an hour earlier. Yet Daniel had been missing for 5 days. The men searched every inch of the boat again, checking storage compartments and even the small area beneath the deck where tools were kept. Daniel was nowhere on the vessel. The radio was functioning normally, the fuel tank still had plenty left, and all the fishing equipment appeared undisturbed. Nothing suggested a struggle or accident. It looked exactly like a fisherman had been preparing a quiet meal in the cabin and had stepped outside briefly, except there was no sign of where he went. Authorities examined the boat carefully, trying to understand how it had returned to harbor without anyone on board. One of the investigators noticed something unusual about the engine throttle. It had been tied gently in place with a thin piece of rope, holding the boat at a steady forward speed. That meant the boat had been moving in a straight line for quite some time before drifting into the harbor channel. But the investigators could not determine who had tied the rope there. Over the next several days, they began looking into Daniel's personal life, hoping to find some clue that explained the strange disappearance. At first, nothing stood out. His home was tidy, his finances were normal, and there were no signs that he planned to leave town. However, during the search of his house, they discovered a small collection of notebooks stored in a drawer beside his bed. Daniel had apparently been writing short observations about his fishing trips, something like a personal log of things he noticed while out at sea. Most of the entries were ordinary descriptions of weather, water conditions, and fishing locations. But the final few entries were different. They described something Daniel had been seeing at night while anchored in deeper water. According to the notes, several weeks before he disappeared, Daniel began noticing a shape beneath the surface of the ocean near his boat. At first he assumed it was a large fish or possibly a seal, but the shape stayed there for long periods of time without moving. One entry described how the water would sometimes ripple slowly, as if something enormous had shifted just below the surface. Another entry mentioned strange sounds late at night, not like waves or animals, but more like distant tapping against the hull of the boat. The final entry in the notebook was written the night before Daniel left for his last trip. It said that the shape had started appearing closer to the boat each time he went out. He wrote that sometimes when he leaned over the edge of the deck, he could see something pale moving deep in the water below him. The writing ended with a sentence that made the investigators uncomfortable. Daniel had written that whatever was beneath the boat was beginning to follow him. At first, the police considered the possibility that Daniel had simply become paranoid after spending long periods alone at sea. But something about the return of the marble still did not make sense. The untouched meal suggested someone had been alive on that boat very recently. Days passed, and the mystery only grew stranger. Then a commercial fishing vessel reported something unusual several miles offshore. The crew had noticed a cluster of fishing buoys drifting together in an area where Daniel often worked. When they pulled one of the buoys onto their deck, they discovered it belonged to the asterisk marble asterisk. Attached to the line beneath the buoy was a fishing hook, and caught on that hook was something that made the crew uneasy. It was not a fish. It was a long strip of pale material that looked disturbingly like human skin. The authorities examined the strange object and confirmed that it was indeed human tissue, though badly damaged by seawater. At that point, investigators began to suspect that Daniel had fallen overboard and been lost at sea. But the timeline still did not fit. If Daniel had fallen days earlier, who had cooked the fresh meal inside the cabin, and who had tied the rope around the throttle to guide the boat home, several weeks later the final piece of the puzzle appeared in a way no one expected. A marine research team studying deep-sea species nearby reported an encounter with a rarely seen creature that sometimes approached fishing vessels at night. The animal was an enormous species of deep-water eel known for unusual behavior around lights and sounds. According to the researchers, these eels were intelligent enough to interact with floating objects and occasionally became curious about boats anchored above them. One of the researchers explained something unsettling. Large eels sometimes fed on bodies that sank into deep water. Over time, they developed a strange habit of following fishing vessels, especially if they had previously fed near those boats. When investigators heard that explanation, they returned to Daniel's notebook. The final entries suddenly seemed less like paranoia. They realized Daniel might have noticed the creature circling his boat for weeks, and something about his final fishing trip likely ended with him going over the side of the vessel while the eel waited below. The disturbing detail came from a second note discovered tucked between the notebook pages. In shaky handwriting, Daniel had written that he sometimes saw the pale body of the creature rising slowly beneath the surface, and that its long shape often brushed against the hull of the Marable at night. He had written that the tapping sounds were not random. They happened whenever he cooked fish on the stove. It seemed the animal had learned that the smell of food meant something edible was nearby. Investigators eventually concluded that on Daniel's final night at sea, while he was cooking his meal inside the cabin, the eel likely struck the side of the boat hard enough to knock him off balance when he stepped outside. Once he fell into the dark water, the animal below would have found him immediately. But the strangest part of the entire story still remained. Because the engine throttle had been tied with rope, and Daniel always tied his knots in a very specific style, when the investigators compared that rope to the knots used on the rest of the boat, they realized something unsettling. The knot around the throttle did not match Daniel's usual knots. It was looser, uneven, almost like something without hands had struggled to twist the rope into place. No one could explain why a deep-sea eel would circle a boat for weeks, or how it might have learned to react to the smell of cooking fish. But the harbor workers eventually settled on one quiet explanation that spread through the docks. They believed that after the creature dragged Daniel into the water, it stayed near the boat waiting for more food. And when the smell of the cooked fish continued drifting out from the cabin, the animal may have pushed and nudged the boat repeatedly, slowly moving it across the water as it searched for the source of the smell. Eventually, the drifting vessel, guided only by the current and the steady engine Daniel had left running, found its way back to the harbor. Inside the cabin, the plate of fish remained exactly where Daniel had left it, and the investigators later realized something that no one in town liked to mention. The fish on the plate had not been touched, which meant the creature that followed Daniel all those weeks had not been interested in the food he cooked. It had only been waiting for him.